Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto had different personality and acted like a demon. Some monsters are born, others are created, some redeem themselves, others have to be redeemed, but the worst monsters are those that were never monsters to begin with. A child's mind is a fragile thing, it will only take so much. The question is, what does it take to put back together? Find out here. Welcome aboard. Chapter 1, First Link. Kusari no Naruto. The Kyuubi no Kitsune, the nine-tailed fox, was said to be the most powerful of the Bijou. A living natural disaster. For ages, back before time immemorial when the current names of the countries were barely a thought, it had been heralded as a sign of oncoming destruction. It was known as a mass of hatred and evil, its sheer presence cowing mortals as it cut swaths across the continent. However, that same fox, for all its power, currently found itself impotent within one Uzumaki Naruto, a young blonde-haired child from the shinobi village of Konohagakure. 7 years ago, it was released from its previous container under unknown circumstances, only to almost immediately be sealed into a newborn. Not however, until it had cut a swath of destruction across the village that would remain in their collective memory for generations. Right now, the all-powerful Bijou lay in the dank, dark confines of the 8-trigram seal that was his prison. Great metal bars spanned his vision, leading into the more brightly lit room beyond, where he was sure that one day his container would stand before him as the others had. If he was anything like the last two, it would also be the last time they met. He would be told to remain silent and docile like some domesticated pet. That, or his new container would demand his power and keep him in the worst kind of servitude, just like that man. Of course, the Kyuubi didn't particularly care about the idle whims of short-lived mortals, they would pass on while he remained, as it always had been and always would be. However, for such a long-lived creature, to be imprisoned for even a fraction of that time was not only insulting, but infuriating. Not only that, but to add insult to injury, it was human to do it, the weak, feeble creatures his progenitor held in such high regard. A low growl briefly escaped the beast's lips, echoing off into the empty space of the seal behind him which, as far as he could tell, was infinite. For once though, in his 7 years of newly instated imprisonment, the echoing noise was not met by utter and all-consuming silence, but an answer. Still as grumpy as ever, Baka Fox? Immediately, one great, bloodshot eye snapped open in the direction of the all-too-familiar voice. Sure enough, with her vivid red hair trailing down her back, stood his former container, tantalizingly out of reach behind the bars of the seal. Kushina. It was more of a growl than an actual attempt at speech, but it got the massive beast's point across. Ha, you look a lot smaller than I remember you. I get Ninakuen did a good job with the sealing. That very same slitted eye narrowed dangerously as the Kyuubi snorted once, sending Kushina's hair fluttering from the hot exhalation. You look a lot less dead than I remember you. I had hoped you would stay that way once you were impaled on my claw. As if to punctuate its words, it lifted up one massive hand, clicking its gleaming white claws together just behind the bars. Kushina remained unperturbed, an easygoing grin splitting her face as she leant almost casually against the bars. Can't keep an Uzumaki down with a little thing like death. I'm going to protect my Sochi for as long as I can, Tebane. At that exclamation, the Kyuubi seemed to unfurl, sudden, furry bulk appearing out of the shadows that had previously concealed it. He rose up to his current full height, which was irritatingly below his prime, and stared down at Kushina, bringing his full presence to bear. Unfortunately, it was greatly diluted by the blasted seal, so Kushina was still able to grin right back at him, unintimidated by the walking catastrophe. And by protect. The beast turned its head so it could bring a single great eye around to peer at the woman. Despite his diminished size, the Kyuubi's eye alone was still taller than her, and Kushina was able to see herself reflected in his scara as the massive slitted pupil narrowed. I'm going to make sure you can never hurt my Sochi's, Tebane. The woman looked down at the ground for a moment, her features furrowing into a frown. He's been hurt enough already. However, far from the reaction she was expecting, the Kyuubi simply rose back up, a barking sound that could very well have been a laugh thundering through the seal. You would be very welcome to try Uzumaki, but as you can see, this is not your seal. To punctuate its booming words, the lumbering creatures slammed both of its forepaws down on the shadowy ground within the cage, causing the entire seal to rumble. Here, I am very much free, none of your chains to hold me down. Step within these shadows and I will make your end both long and excruciating, for the imprisonment you subjected me to. Briefly letting a slight look of worry pass over her features, Kushina quickly found her resolve and steel quickly entered her violet eyes. You have only half your power now, Tebane. My chains were good enough to hold you before, and they will be again. I'll make sure you'll never be able to hurt Naruto. As she spoke, Kushina began making long sweeping motions with her hands, drawing large black characters in the air that slowly snaked their way up and around her arm, down to her stomach. There, they created a facsimile of the seal written on her son's stomach which, upon completion, caused the small paper tag binding the bars of the cage together to flutter uselessly to the ground, revealing a spiral-esque lock. "You will regret this decision, human." Kushina grinned back defiantly as she twisted the spiraled seal on her stomach, an action mirrored by the actual lock. "Bring it on, fuzzball Atebane." Normally when the average villager of Kanahagakure knows Sato thought of Uzumaki Naruto, and it would be a fleeting thought at best, not the most pleasant things came to mind. However, many would agree he was a rather hyperactive, ever-smiling, blonde nuisance of a child with a too large mouth and an annoying, if not exuberant, voice. That was why they might not have recognized the sad child, slumped over on a swing in one of Konoha's parks, gently pushing himself back and forth with sluggish movements of his feet. Of course, the sunflower yellow, spiky hair and 6 whisker-like marks on his cheeks gave him away, but the tears slowly leaking down his cheeks were a relatively unseen addition. It had been at a young age when Naruto had first figured out that, for whatever reason, he was not well liked by the village in general. Years of being blatantly ignored by adults, children playing with him one day only to run away from him the next, or worse, call him names and pick on him, had taught him that well enough. However, under the guidance of the nice old man he had recently come to know as the Hokage, he persevered, doing his best to get people to accept him, or just acknowledge him. Of course, he was a child, and there was only so far a child's patience lasted before it snapped, so occasionally he would lash out with a prank. For a time, they seemed to get him some recognition, even if it was in the form of infamy, but soon enough people simply returned to ignoring his various outbursts. It was getting to the point that Naruto was beginning to believe he would have to do something bigger, or more extravagant to get people to stop ignoring him. A quiet sigh escaped his lips as he pushed back off the ground, never taking his eyes off the ground. It hadn't been a good day. This morning he had made his breakfast as usual, but the milk was horribly expired. It was strange because he had bought that very same milk just the day before. All the same, it had made him incredibly queasy. He had decided to make up for it by going out to the park to see if there were any kids who would play with him. No luck there. The first group of kids he had come across had offered to play ninja with him, letting him hide first. It had been almost an hour before he realized they weren't even looking for him. Then, on his way back to see what had happened, he saw some bullies a few years older than him picking on a young girl with weird milky eyes. He had stood up to them only to get the snot beaten out of him. When he had managed to pick himself up, the girl wasn't even there anymore. She probably ran off like all the others. Finally, as if to top off the worst date in recent memory, he had gone to a store to buy some replacement clothes for the ones the bullies had ripped and torn up only to get thrown out of the store. Maybe not so much physically, but the shopkeeper had made sure he knew just how welcome he was. Another sigh escaped his lips at the same time a shudder passed through his body. The sun was beginning to set and it was getting cold. His ripped clothes weren't exactly offering much protection. Still, he decided to just sit there for a while longer, at least until he could get the damn tears to stop falling down his cheeks. The Kyuubi grinned menacingly as his tail swatted away another volley of chains from the surprisingly fast-moving former Kunoichi. However, while he would never trade away his imposing size and intimidating presence, there was something to be said for having a smaller body. It made him lighter on his feet for one. He used that as he suddenly jumped into the air, shocking the Kunoichi, who was a bit more used to seeing the Kyuubi stationary, bound to the rock within her own seal. He span in midair, his tails whipping around his form like some kind of furry buzzsaw before crashing into the ground right over where Kushina stood. For a moment his rapidly spinning body ground against the hastily erected dome of chains Kushina had brought up, but while the Kyuubi was at only half power at the moment, Kushina was a mere fragment of her former self and his overwhelming bulk and chakra won out. However, it had given Kushina enough time to dodge out of the way, so instead he crashed into the seemingly indestructible ground. Suddenly there were hundreds of puffs of smoke around him as a plethora of Kushinas popped into existence about his body, all of them sending out dozens of bright golden chains at him. "You're weak, human." While the chains were numerous, they were weakened by the division of the original's chakra, and the Kyuubi was able to lift himself up from where he was being restrained without much difficulty. Lashing out with his tails, he caused a plethora of smoky clouds to erupt about him with each shadow clone's destruction. "You can't restrain me anymore." The writhing beast managed to lift its head up high as little balls of black and white energy began to coalesce above his snout, forming a roiling purple sphere of energy, which quickly proceeded to shrink to the size of the average human fist. Seeing what was happening, the remaining Kushina clones all desperately tried to get away, some of them throwing up strong barriers with their chains. It was all for naught though as the bijou swallowed the massively condensed mass of unstable chakra. A moment later it opened its mouth, releasing an enormous blast of energy in a near-constant stream that split through the air with a deafening ring. The seal shook from the tremors as the Kyuubi swung his head around, indiscriminately destroying any shadow clones in the vicinity, effortlessly tearing through their flimsy barriers. When the bright white light finally died down, the fox grinned sadistically as he looked around for the original, even checking under its great paws to see if he stepped on her by accident. Slowly his tail swung behind him, flicking out every so often and sending great gales in random directions, hoping to upset the little bug from her hiding place. Bared teeth, the size of two men, gleamed with saliva at the thought of the torture he would put his former container through. Near the entrance of the cage, Kushina suddenly sprang up from where she had been hiding, bolting towards the massive gates as fast as she was able. She had made a huge mistake coming into the seal. She had underestimated the Kyuubi massively, and now not only her, but Naruto might pay for it. One arm hung limply at her side, burned and scorched, and her hair, usually a neatly combed waterfall, was a frayed mess. A smile alighted on her lips as her foot crossed the threshold of the seal, only to immediately twist into a look of pure horror and shock. "You lose, human." Shakily she looked down to see the long white claw emerging from her midsection, an all too familiar scene. She fought through the pain, shooting out two chains from her palm that vanished into the corridors of the seal outside the gate. The Kyuubi grunted in annoyance at that, not quite understanding what she had done, especially when the chains disconnected from her hands and snaked off into the darkness of the hallways. When he dragged the defeated woman back into the dark and silence of the seal, the massive gated bars slamming shut behind her due to the destruction of the temporary key on her stomach, she had a tired, but victorious smile on her face. "I haven't lost yet." Blood dribbled down the corner of her mouth as the Kyuubi lifted her up, still impaled through the midsection, so they were somewhat face to face. "You've lost, you just don't know it yet. Naruto will beat you and become the savior Mina-chan wanted him to be." For a moment there was silence as the two simply stared at one another in the darkness of the seal, Kushina staring up defiantly despite the grievous wound. "It matters little, the boy will come to claim my chakra only to lose himself in it. For now, I have you entertain me." At that Kushina grinned a bloody smile as her entire form started to fade away, the chakra Minato had implanted into the seal running out. "You're too late, fuzzball, my time here's up and I've done all I can to make sure Naruto has every weapon he needs to defeat you." For a moment the Kyuubi frowned as he saw his retribution fade away in front of him before a far more malicious look overcame his features. Slowly, almost tauntingly, he brought one of his long, swaying tails up over his shoulder, pressing it into Kushina's chest. The woman could only look on in horror as her semi-translucent form suddenly gained substance again as she was infused with a massive quantity of chakra from the fox. "I never gave you permission to die, human." Suddenly Kushina screamed as the chakra began to burn at her. As if the Kyuubi was filling her with boiling hot magma, every nerve ending in her chakra-constructed body screamed in pain. "There's too many things we have left to do." Naruto groaned as he walked along the street. The sun had set a while ago and eventually his tears had dried up, forcing him to sluggishly get off the swing and start walking back to his small apartment. As he walked, he clutched at his stomach, wondering just what that milk had done to him as it felt like there was a small battle going on in his guts. He waved it off, wiping his brow of the sweat that had begun to accumulate there before groaning again. He kept going with thoughts that at least there was a warm bed waiting for him at home, and in a few days the Hokage had promised to take him to some ramen stand the man said he would like. The thoughts of warm ramen filling his nose and mouth got him another few streets before he finally had enough and slumped over on a nearby wall, his vision swimming uncomfortably. He felt bile rising up his throat and forced himself to swallow it down, only making him turn a paler shade of white as his eyes began to drift. Finally, with a small whimper, he fell over onto his side, his world going dark. The last thing he felt was a warm burning in his stomach that slowly spread out through his body from the soles of his feet to the tips of his fingers. Oddly enough though, it only felt like a moment later when his eyes flickered back open and he groggily pulled himself to his feet. He did absently wonder when it had started raining though, as he was definitely lying in some kind of puddle. Through bleary eyes he quickly worked out he was no longer on the street. In fact, he seemed to be in some long corridor that stretched off into darkness in both directions. Confusion still racking his mind, he got up and began walking in the direction he felt wind coming from. He had explored Konoha sewers once as an inquisitive child, and that was the method he had used to find his way out. He kept walking for another 5 minutes, never encountering so much as a bend in the corridor. His fear began to show in the slight tremble in his lip, wondering just where he was and if he would ever get out. His worries were put to the side as he finally emerged into a large, cavernous room that's ceiling stretched far up into the darkness. One wall was completely dominated by an enormous metal gate. Hello? He called. It was far more timid than he would have liked, but in this oppressive, empty room, with what looked suspiciously like prison bars, he couldn't help but feel nervous. Even now he felt warm gusts of air blow past him, ruffling his tattered clothes, yet he got the idea that venturing past the thick bars would be a terrible idea. Hello? He tried again, louder this time, only to hear his own voice echo through the darkness beyond the cage, with no answer for a good few seconds. Naruto? Suddenly, from the darkness that seemed like a tangible wall just behind the bars, a single feminine hand emerged, gripping the cold metal. It was quickly followed by the rest of her as a tall, red-haired woman emerged from the bars, her violet eyes tearing up as she looked at the young boy who wasn't sure what to make of all this. Is that you, my Sochi? Naruto unconsciously took a step back, wondering what kind of messed up dream he had fallen into. Seeing his recoil, the woman frowned, taking another step only to meet some kind of invisible wall. Who are you? The woman reached her hands out imploringly for a moment, a look of genuine longing in her eyes as she took in the young blonde-haired boy's reaction to her. Don't you recognize me, Naruto? I'm your mother. Naruto took another step back, his mouth working uselessly like a fish as his breath caught in his throat. Finally though, as a tear was about to escape his eye, his face became indignant. You're not my mom, the old man said. She died, a hero of Konoha. Almost instantly that warm, longing look on the woman's face melted away as if it had been nothing more than a thin mask, revealing a cruel smile and two slitted red eyes. The body dispersed into what looked like dust, before flowing back into the seal where it was wallowed into the darkness. Instead, what emerged were those same vicious eyes, only scaled up 100 times as Naruto felt an almost tangible weight settle over his shoulders. Ah well, it couldn't last forever, a very different voice boomed. Naruto fell back, his breath quickening as the demon standing just a few meters away from him continued to bore into his small form with his gaze. Pitiful, this is the child they chose to be my container, at least the others could stand in my presence. As if breaking the trance over him, Naruto shook his head, managing to work himself onto his feet shakily, if nothing else to prove to whatever this creature was that he could. Naruto shook his head again, trying to throw off the oppressive feeling falling across his body like layers of stiflingly hot snow. What are you? His answer was an enormous gust of wind that was likely the creature snorting derisively. How original, why don't you ask something interesting, like where you are? Naruto, surprisingly, found a scowl on his face at being so easily dismissed. He had enough of that from the villagers to get it from whatever this demon was. I asked you a question, Utabeo. One of the great red eyes beyond the gate quirked up in amusement at that before both lowered so they could better stare at Naruto's now less shaky form. Oh, some backbone appears in the little human. Very well, I am the Kyuubi no Kitsune. At that Naruto blinked, his mind going blank for a few moments. This was the creature that ravaged and nearly destroyed Konoha on the day of his birth? But the yondaime. He was cut off by another large gust of warm breath that nearly bowled him over as the creature snorted again. Could do little to stop a creature like me without sealing it into a human, and even then he could only do it halfway. Naruto's mind was now working overtime. He knew little of ninja arts like Fuinjutsu. He would be learning those in a month's time when he joined the academy. However, one thing became starkly obvious to him as he looked up at the creature. Sealed in a human? Suddenly something new appeared from the shadows, a great long row of teeth in a vicious parody of a grin. Specifically, you. Suddenly, so much made sense to Naruto, his birthdate coinciding with the Kyuubi attack, the villagers' hatred of him, the hushed whispers just out of earshot. But why? Why do they hate me if you're you and I'm me? Either his whisper to himself had gone unheard by the Bijou or the fox hadn't deigned to answer. It was obvious enough to him that he wasn't the Kyuubi. After all, he was standing in front of the creature right now. For a moment Naruto looked down at his feet, his face rushing through a flurry of emotions before finally settling on one of determination. I don't care. Behind the bars the Kyuubi simply watched on impassively, still grinning that gruesome smile. I don't care if they hate me because if you, I'll just try harder and one day they'll recognize me, that's what the old man said. There was silence as Naruto panted, feeling a little hoarse from his sudden bout of screaming up at the Kyuubi. You are foolish child. Naruto looked up in surprise as the Kyuubi finally broke the silence, his grin never wavering for a moment. Humans are weak, idiotic creatures, slaves to their baser emotions. They are full of hatred and greed and will never break the endless cycle of suffering and pain they inflict on themselves. They will never accept you, because you represent what they fear, what they hate. Despite the grin, the Kyuubi's words were spoken forcefully, nearly making Naruto take a step back again. Their own weakness. Naruto frowned up at the colossal mass of chakra, his stomach wavering as its oppressive presence pressed down on him. Why would I believe anything you say? You're a demon. Another gust of air met him, casing his flimsy clothes to sway in the artificial breeze. A pathetic human title for beings beyond their comprehension. It matters little what I am, just that I accept it. Power is the only thing that will get you anywhere in your brief, fleeting life. Without it, the acknowledgement you seek will forever be out of your grasp. Suddenly the wide grin behind the bars grew even further as the massive beast inched his face forward until it was almost pressing at the bars. I can offer you that power. Right now, Naruto believed the saying "deal with the devil" never seemed more appropriate. I don't need what you have to offer. I can become strong on my own at Tebeo. The fox merely grunted as it pulled its face away, the grin disappearing into the shadows and the eyes slowly closing. Believe what you will, mortal, one day you will return for my power. Until that day, struggle on with your pathetic life, you will come to see what I say holds true. With that, the great eyes closed and the interior of the cage was once again nothing but darkness and shadow. Only the slow, steady breathing and the rushes of warm air showed the Kyuubi was still very much in there, a constant reminder of the burden Naruto was now aware of. Before Naruto could retort, he felt his world turning dark once again, his body fading away. When his eyes opened again, it was to the darkened street corner he had collapsed on. With a groan, he dragged himself to his knees before shakily standing up. For a moment he wondered if all of that was just some strange hallucination brought on by bad milk, but as a shudder passed down his spine, some intrinsic part of him knew that it had been all too real. He had felt every one of the Kyuubi's warm breaths, and shuddered at the reminder of the beast's overwhelming presence. Still feeling groggy from it all, he stumbled out into the street, and just so happened to bump right into the one lone drunk staggering back home. The man almost absently swatted Naruto aside in his stupor with the end of the bottle held limply in one hand, some of the liquid sloshing out and over Naruto's shirt. The young blonde fell to the ground in a heap, clutching at his head as the man turned to look at him. To apologize or complain he would never find out, as the man took one look at him, sneered and turned to go. Naruto wasn't sure what it was right at that moment, maybe just a lot of pent-up frustration, maybe the Kyuubi's words had struck a chord with him. Or it could have been the sliver of the beast's chakra that had leaked into his body thanks to Kushina weakening the seal. Either way, he suddenly had enough, with all the villagers ignoring him like his presence was meaningless. So, what if he contained some monster? He was still Uzumaki Naruto Kami, damn it. Hey, watch where you're going, jerk, Tebeo. The drunkard froze at the fiery words, his head tilting to one side as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Slowly, he turned back to the blonde who by now had picked himself up. He was obviously quite drunk as he was unsteady on his feet and his eyes weren't quite focusing. What was that, Gaki? His tone was dangerous, but Naruto couldn't find it in him to care. Just for once he didn't want to put up with it, he wanted someone to acknowledge him. I said watch where you're going, team. Quite suddenly the drunk's unfocused eyes narrowed, gaining a dangerous glint as he glared at the young boy who stared defiantly back. I'll give you another chance to apologize, kid, before I get angry. He took a step forward and for a moment Naruto faltered, but suddenly there it was again, that warm feeling spreading out from his stomach. A burst of determination filled him and he squared up to the man who was over twice his size. You're the one who should apologize, Bakayaro. The drunk nodded slowly, almost as if he was agreeing, a small chuckle escaping his lips that didn't sound all that warm. He turned, looking as though he were simply going to leave. That was why Naruto was completely unprepared for when he suddenly snapped back around. Before the boy knew it, something cracked against the side of his skull and he was thrown off his feet. He couldn't even do anything before there was another blinding pain in his side as the man kicked him again. You shoulda apologized, kid. Naruto couldn't respond, his face was scrunched up in pain, tears streaming down his face as he attempted to curl up into a ball to avoid the worst of the beating. He felt so weak at that moment, so utterly helpless, and worst of all he knew that tomorrow he would wake up and nothing would have changed, the people would continue to ignore him. Adults would keep hating him, and he was powerless to stop any of it. Abruptly, he realized that the beating had stopped. He tentatively opened his eyes, hoping the man had decided to just leave. W.A.? His eyes shot open as he looked up into the face of the drunk who, only moments ago, had been stomping him into the ground. Only now he was lifted into the air, impaled through his body in various places by gleaming chains made of ethereal golden light. In his shock, it took Naruto a moment to realize the chains were coming out of his own body. Trembling, he turned to look up at the man, only for his eyes to widen. There was an expression he had never really seen outside of the mirror on the man's face. It wasn't anger, or hate, or even indifference, it was fear. The man was looking down at him with fear because he no longer had the power to harm him, because Naruto was the one in control. Slowly Naruto raised a shaking hand up towards the man only for the drunk to flinch, his whole body shaking as blood dripped from his wounds. A long stream of it flowed down one of the chains to pool on Naruto's hand. It was oddly warm. Naruto just looked at it for a moment as it flowed over his skin. The warmth was new and, for a fleeting moment, he was reminded of the Kyuubi's deception. He wondered if this was like the warmth of a mother's touch. The man still being held in the air by glowing chains whimpered as the child finally looked up from staring at his blood-covered hand. Except, it wasn't the same child that had looked down. Naruto now sported a deep, unnerving scowl. He raised his hand again, only now there wasn't so much as a tremor. The man whose name he didn't even know died without a whimper, as a final chain burst from his palm, impaling him right through the heart. Demon! Naruto's head snapped around, catching sight of an elderly woman whose eyes were wide with horror and fear. She quickly turned to run away, to warn someone of what Naruto had just done only for a timid voice to call out behind her. Wait, please. She slowed, only to regret that decision a moment later as in a single moment a thick red-stained chain ripped through her chest, holding her in place. A moment later Naruto appeared in front of her, looking up into her eyes with a strange, searching expression. Sorry, I just wanted to see that look on your face again. Gradually, as the woman stopped convulsing, the expression twisted into a cold, slightly manic smile. Konoha had always called him a monster. That night, he simply decided to agree with them. Chapter 2, Second Link. Hiruzen's tired eyes watched as a ring of smoke lazily drifted away from his pipe. It was carried over to the open window that looked out on the village he loved dearly. His hands were placed behind his back and he stood with such rigid poise he might have been mistaken for a sculpture at first glance. However, the illusion was shattered when he let out a troubled sigh that really spoke of his age. A migraine was coming, and the reason was one Uzumaki Naruto, or perhaps, the two civilians he had killed. They're howling for blood, Hiruzen, you can't keep them at bay for much longer. Any attempt to sate them now and preserve what innocence the boy has left will be a fool's errand. The lightest of frowns creased the aged man's already wrinkled features as one of his oldest friends, if not perhaps the closest, spoke up from behind him. He didn't turn though, still looking out over his village, framed by the setting sun lighting the sky up in brilliant hues of red and orange that made Hai no Kuni so famous. Don't think I don't know that, Danzo. Another tired sigh escaped his lips. It was a bad day when he had begun to agree with the old warhawk over matters concerning Naruto. The boy is obviously unstable, he can't remain among the normal populace as he is. Hiruzen's frown only deepened, but he quickly calmed himself by taking another long drag from his pipe, a gift from his son before their relationship became so strained. And whose fault is that, Danzo? There was no accusation in the tone, more one of general hopelessness. The boy has every right to be unbalanced, with everything that has been thrust upon his shoulders. He could hear the tap of Danzo's cane on the wooden floor of his office as the crippled man crossed the room to stand beside him, a rare sight as of the last few years. All the same, he is a risk to the village at large. This isn't just a case of an average shinobi having emotional issues, the boy is a literal bomb. The yandere is no longer among us. A pained expression crossed Hiruzen's features as he was reminded of yet another failure of his that he had made over his long life. Some might say too long, and we would not survive another attack from the beast. Slowly the sun slipped down behind the horizon, casting more and more of the village into shadow. So, you would have me hand him over to you? To have his emotions stripped away just so he won't be a threat anymore? He didn't need to turn to see Danzo's curt nod, yet it still managed to elicit a small, frustrated sigh as Hiruzen closed his eyes for just a moment. Destroy one life to preserve thousands, even if it was a child who already had far too large a burden placed upon them. Was this how the yandere had felt? It is the only safe option at this point, and we both know this to be true. You had your chance and it turned into yet another debacle, unsettling the already delicate situation with the Uchiha. We cannot wait and hope this passes, Hiruzen. The academy proved that well enough. The tapping started up again as Danzo walked out of the office, the old men separating once again as Danzo returned to the darkened shadows of Konoha, leaving Hiruzen standing in the light. He was ashamed to say it, but sometimes Hiruzen had wished it was the other way around. The expectation upon him were supposed to have been relieved 9 years ago. You will eventually have to agree with me, Hiruzen, we both know it. And with that the sound of tapping faded away until once again Hiruzen was left with nothing but his thoughts and memories. I can't believe that, not yet. He turned up to the Hokage monument, drawing strength from the silent visages of his predecessors and the man who was supposed to take these burdens from his shoulders. I couldn't do that to Minato. However, as much as he told himself these things, an alternative did not present itself. It was true that Naruto needed to disappear from the public eye, preferably somewhere where he couldn't hurt the people around him. He would need to be with people that could understand his situation and could contain him if worst came to worst. However, he couldn't just neglect the fact the boy was a Jinchuriki, he would eventually need to be trained. For his own safety if nothing else. Hokage-sama. A lone Anbu dropped from the ceiling, seemingly out of the shadows themselves and without even a whisper of a sound. Hiruzen didn't turn to face the masked shinobi, but they still knew to continue. Saru's squad has returned to the village ahead of schedule, do you wish me to redeploy them as soon as possible? At that Hiruzen wanted to throw his head in his hands. If there was any contender for something that gave him almost as many troubles as Naruto, it would be that damn squad. However, just as Hiruzen was about to acquiesce to the Anbu's suggestion, his hand paused in midair, a tiny flame suddenly alight behind his eyes. Actually, no, bring them to my office as soon as possible. He couldn't see it behind the emotionless porcelain mask, but the Hokage was sure the Anbu had his eyebrow raised. There were no questioning the village leader's orders though, and the only visible response he received was a slight tilt of the head before the Anbu was gone as quickly and as silently as he entered. Slowly Hiruzen nodded his head just once. This may just work. Naruto felt particularly good as he walked down the central road in Konoha, shown by the toothy grin that rested on his features. As he passed, people gave him an incredibly wide berth, some even walking off in different directions when they saw him. Some turned away, others whispered to people close to them, all of them had looks of fear in their eyes. This is what Naruto had wanted, not their respect, not their love, but their acknowledgement. He finally had it through simple fear. It might have had something to do with the fact that, as he walked, long golden chains flickered out around him, tipped by vicious serrated blades that almost looked like kunai. Some swayed behind him like tails, others reared up over his shoulders like cobras poised to strike, all of them looked menacing. Then again, he might have been smiling because he couldn't help but replay a particularly funny memory over and over again. Around a week ago the Hokage had told him he would be entering the academy, and to be honest Naruto relished the idea. It seemed perfect, go in, learn how to kill people and become stronger, walk out and do those things. The reality was far from that though. Naruto was bored, very bored, so bored that chains started to subconsciously appear from his shoulders, looking around as though they were living entities of their own. On the bright side, it really seemed to freak out the mousy-haired kid to his left. Way to his left. Nobody wanted to sit next to the demented-looking freak after all. Not after he had thrown a boy he had later found was called Kiba across the room and nearly through a wall. Naruto wasn't sure why they had looked at him strangely. The boy had made fun of his height, saying he didn't look strong and the only thing an Inuzuka could respect was strength and dominance. Naruto had just educated the boy that appearances can be deceiving. He wondered if Kiba respected him now, or would, when the kid woke up from unconsciousness. Right now, the new academy entrants were sitting in a tiered classroom listening to a lecture from the man who would be their instructor for the next year or two. Naruto had tuned him out half an hour ago when he had started talking about some flaming will or something. His ears twitched when he finally heard something interesting, his chains twitched too, but that only seemed to make people shuffle even further away from him. The instructor smiled brightly as he looked around the room, everywhere but at Naruto of course, and clapped his hands together. The very same man only minutes ago had asked Naruto to put away his chains because it was unnerving the other children. Naruto had responded by pinning the man to the wall. He was a little more accepting of the golden attachments after that. In Naruto's opinion he was lucky he had only pierced him through the clothes, the holes were still there. Maybe that was why the other kids gave him a wide berth? Alright kids, as a fun exercise to ingratiate you to academy life, we're going to the training fields out back to have a few test spars, just to see where you guys are at. He quickly answered a few questions from some of the civilian children, mostly him settling their worries that they had no prior training, before leading the class out to the back of the academy. There, a small ring was set up. It was just a simple rope laid out in a circle to mark a boundary, but that was all they really needed for academy students. After all, they didn't know any devastating or landscape-altering jutsu yet. Okay, would anybody like to volunteer for the first spar? When he got no takers he just smiled warmly. No need to be shy, it's all friendly here. Slowly one of the boys near the front of the crowd raised their hand, a dark-haired boy with bright black eyes. Ah, Sasuke, perfect. The boy smiled timidly before stepping into the ring. The Chunin turned back to the crowd of students only to pale as he saw another hand raised up. Anybody like to spar with Sasuke? The hand stayed up, but the Chunin managed to keep his eyes anywhere but on it, even when a gold chain snaked up into the air to make the child more visible. Anybody at all? Unfortunately for him, at that moment Naruto got tired of waiting and simply stepped through the crowd. Oh, okay then, Naruto against Sasuke. The instructor's eyes nervously glanced between the two kids. Naruto didn't even have his chains out, but something about his expression, the longing for the fight, it was unsettling. First we make the seal of confrontation. This is an important art of traditional shinobi sparring. It acknowledges that you are equals. A quiet snort came from Naruto, but the instructor ignored it, showing them both the hand sign. Afterwards you will make the seal of reconciliation, to show that there are no hard feelings after the spar is over. Again, the Chunin showed them the seal before finally stepping back. Okay, on my signal. He raised his arm and you could just feel the tension in the air from the group of silent students. Hajime. Sasuke suddenly bolted forward. As an Uchiha he had been receiving training for much of his young life, so naturally he felt as though he had an edge over most kids, especially in taijutsu. Of course, Naruto had no intention of only sticking to taijutsu, where he was sure his scrawnier and smaller stature would be an immediate disadvantage. That was why Sasuke was shocked as a bright gold chain suddenly lashed out at him from Naruto's stomach, all without the blonde moving an inch. It struck him just beneath his ribs, sending his skidding backwards on his ass with the breath knocked out of him. However, Naruto didn't do it hard enough to knock him out of the ring. That would be too short, it wouldn't be any fun. Sasuke's eyes immediately widened as he saw another serrated chain flying at him, forcing him to roll to the side. Of course, the chain simply diverted course, looping around Sasuke's ankle before picking the boy up off the ground and dangling him there by the leg. Naruto, stop this, it's supposed to be a taijutsu match only. Naruto snorted loudly as the chain whipped the young dark-haired boy across the arena, slamming him painfully into the ground before picking him back up again, dragging his face along the ground while he was at it. Why would I limit myself like that? I would only get beaten. For a moment his spiky hair fell across his eyes, shadowing them as his head tilted forward, his hands clenching into fists. I refuse to lose anymore. Suddenly the chain holding Sasuke cracked like a whip, sending the boy flying into the air. The instructor moved to catch him, but the chains were just a construct of chakra and were as light as Naruto wanted them to be. They were faster. One shot out from his palm, slicing through the air before impaling the poor Uchiha right through the thigh, painfully pulling him back to the ground. Naruto grinned at the scream he had managed pulled out of the young boy while their classmates looked on, half terrified and half disgusted. He would have slammed the boy into the ground again had the Chunin not just gotten beneath him, catching the boy and quickly pulling the chain out of his leg. He took consolation from the second scream Sasuke gave. He had nothing personal against the boy, he didn't even know him before today, but he was unlucky enough to have volunteered. Giving the blonde a quick glare, the Chunin quickly rushed Sasuke off to the hospital, but not before Naruto called after him. But sensei, I thought we were supposed to make the seal of reconciliation. The Chunin was already gone, leaving a smirking Naruto alone with the rest of the class. He turned to see them staring at him with varying levels of fear and unease. What? They all flinched, making him grin again as he walked right past them. He supposed the academy wasn't so boring after all. He still had that smile on his face as he walked towards the training grounds, not even realizing he had arrived before stepping over the boundary into the large grassy clearing. After the incident with the Uchiha, he had been temporarily pulled from the academy. The Hokage had told him he was just unsuited to study there. It was only recently, though, that he had been told there was now an alternative, which was why he was here. He leant against a tree as he waited for whoever was supposed to turn up, watching the sun begin to descend below the horizon in the distance. Suddenly, he dived forward, eyes wide, as a line of kunai that would have run the length of his body thudded into the tree trunk he had just been resting against. Breathing suddenly fast and shallow, he forced a few chains out of his body. It was just in time to swat away another volley of the deadly ninja tools. Better than I thought. I honestly wasn't expecting him to survive the first volley, a calm voice from seemingly all around Naruto, making his head dart about nervously before he forced that expression away and replaced it with a deep scowl. Who's there? A short laugh from a different, more nasally voice was his answer, causing Naruto growl at the casual disregard. Ah, whose turn is it now then? Nezumi, perhaps you want a shot? There was rustling in the trees, but Naruto couldn't tell from where. In the still darkening conditions of the evening his visibility was dropping by the second. Suddenly, reacting on nothing more than instinct, he threw himself forward, sending a volley of chains bursting from his back. There was the clang of metal on metal and he felt resistance through his connection with the chakra constructs, but when he rolled to his feet in a low crouch there was nobody there. Again though, a sort of sixth sense told him there was someone behind him. This time he spun, the chains around him whipping out wildly. Through the sparks created between his weapon and his opponent's, he caught a glimpse of a pale white mask and long, dark hair and a ponytail. However, they quickly vanished in a flicker of motion far too fast for him to keep up with, leaving him alone again in a seemingly empty training ground. To his immense shock, he noticed that a few links on one of his chains were almost completely severed clean through. True, the lighter and therefore faster his chains were the weaker they became, but he had never even seen so much as a scratch on them when he was testing them out. The sight made him even more nervous despite the cold scowl he wore. A quick burst of chakra through the chains, not that Naruto knew it was chakra, healed them up. Doing so was rather draining though, and while Naruto was generally considered quite lively, he was not a bottomless well of energy. Kuma's turn, Kuma's turn. A second voice, much louder, more lively and more childish than the first, made itself known as Naruto's eyes went wide. What could only be described as a roughly human-shaped beast suddenly rushed out of the surrounding shrubbery. Kuma kick! It was so fast that Naruto only briefly caught a glimpse of light blue hair and tan skin covering a mountain of muscle, before he saw nothing but stars, then just nothing at all. Did Kuma break him? Dizzying pain, that was what the young blonde felt as his faculties began to return to him. It was a confusing feeling, not one he hadn't felt before, but given the circumstances he had fallen unconscious in, not one he had expected to feel again. For a moment he heard a roaring laughter that sounded as though it was echoing down a long corridor before his head stopped swimming and he slowly faded back into reality. Stand the hype about the kid, other than the chains I didn't see anything all that special. He remembered that voice, it was the second one he had heard in the clearing. What was going on? Oh, I don't know, there was something to be said about the boy's reflexes. He must have a good set of ears on him at least. That was the first voice, calmer and more disciplined than the other, but he still spoke with a trace of amusement. Naruto was seriously confused, he had been attacked and yet wasn't dead. Did his attackers want him alive for some reason? His chains were sharp. Another new voice, this one definitely a woman's, however, it was low and quiet and whoever it belonged to certainly took their time with their words. Naruto wanted to crack an eye open to see what was going on but he didn't want to let them know he was awake. Oh no, that's high praise from you Nezumi-chan, don't you think Kuma? There was the second voice again. Slowly Naruto worked a chain out through his back, digging it into the earth. He wanted to be prepared. These people were strong, stronger than anybody he had ever met before, at least it felt that way to the blonde. Kuma is sorry for breaking him. He couldn't help it, hearing that loud, childlike voice made a single shudder run down Naruto's back. The chain he was extending though was almost. Don't worry about it too much big guy, in fact, he's awake right now. Suddenly, Naruto sprang to his feet at being caught, pelting off in a random direction as fast as his small legs could carry him. At the same time his chain burst through the ground branching off into as many smaller chains as he could make. Each randomly shot out in every direction like shrapnel. It was for naught though as he hadn't taken 3 steps before he was grabbed by the back of his shirt by a slender but strong hand and quickly hoisted into the air. Please, don't. For just a moment Naruto's legs continued to pump desperately before he realized he had been caught. Immediately Naruto scowled, crushing the helpless feeling within him as he prepared to launch as many chains as he could and turn the person holding him into a pincushion. He would have too, had they not placed a sword's edge dangerously close to his throat, causing him to freeze in place. Please. Don't. This time it was said just a little more forcefully, even if it was in that same dull, husky tone. His body immediately went limp in the woman's hand, he didn't even dare to gulp, the blade was so close to his throat. Now Nezumi-san, there's no need to be so forceful with the boy. Naruto was turned around, still held by his shirt, and for the first time got a good look at his attackers. It was only for a moment though as hearing the kind but stern words the woman had almost immediately dropped him. Okay. Saru Taishu. Naruto winced as he hit the ground before looking back up, wary for what he had seen in that brief instant. Sure enough, when he saw his kidnappers, they bore the white porcelain masks and slate-gray body armor of the ANBU, Konoha's watchful protectors that he would sometimes see darting about rooftops late at night. The one who stood slightly in front of the others, wearing a vaguely monkey-esque mask done in red, spoke in a voice that immediately identified him as this Sarotaishu. Well, aren't you a quiet one? Got a bit of a bite though, don't you? There was that same irritating hint of amusement his voice always seemed to carry, although it seemed warranted as the man was somehow holding the chains Naruto had launched out. All of them. What do you want with me? The blonde growled, not bothering to get up off the ground. He couldn't outrun these people anyway. As much as it pained him to his core to admit even to himself, he was helpless in front of them. Ooh. Ooh. Kuma wants to say. Kuma wants to say. The man Naruto had been doing his best to try and ignore, if he could even be called a man, started bouncing up and down on the spot. Sure enough, the blue markings on his mask denoted him as a bear, and Naruto couldn't have thought of a more fitting animal to represent the mountain of a man. He was all tan muscle, so much so that it didn't even look like he would fit into one of the dark cloaks the other ANBU wore. The blonde swore if he jumped a little higher, he was going to start making tremors in the ground. However, the last man, a short man who might have been mistaken for a child had it not been for his voice, calmed him down. Maybe you should leave this one up to us, Kuma, your explanations tend to get a bit. He genuinely seemed to think of the right word to say as the brute of a man stared at him with a cocked head like some sort of dog. Ah, boisterous. The massive, light blue-haired man just nodded quickly before turning away. Naruto could almost feel the dumb expression on his face. The leader of the three men, Naruto still couldn't see the woman standing just behind him, seemed amused by the whole interaction before turning to Naruto. Yes, well, anyway, as Kuma-san was trying to say, Saro tried to say but was quickly cut off by Naruto, who hadn't stopped glaring at the trio since they had begun talking. Why didn't you kill me? They all paused at that before suddenly the man Naruto assumed was Teiko by process of elimination began laughing. Kill you? What gave you that idea? Naruto blinked before tensing up as the man suddenly approached him, coming down to a crouch right in front of him so that Naruto could pick out every abstract line on his mask. Suddenly his hand whipped out behind him. Just as Naruto was about to try and spear him through the chest though, it came back around holding an ANBU uniform? This was your initiation. Welcome to the Corp, Gaki. Naruto could only blink dumbly as he stared at the simple black clothing atop the standard gray armor, seemingly made in his size. What? That was the limits of Naruto's eloquence at that moment as he lamely stared at the uniform and the blue, bird-esque mask lying on top. He quickly recovered though, his scowl returning as he glared back at Teiko. Chains began to writhe out of his wrists menacingly. Why would I want to join ANBU? I'm not even a shinobi yet. Teiko didn't give him an answer he was expecting. Instead, the short man just chuckled, reaching forward and ruffling Naruto's hair before the blonde could even react. Who said anything about you wanting to Gaki, or should I call you Karasu? Crow? Now that Naruto looked at the mask, it did bear somewhat of a resemblance to the carrion bird. Slowly the chains retracted and Naruto got to his feet, looking around at the four ANBU members. He wasn't sure how, call it some childish intuition, or maybe a killer's perspective, but each one of them looked poised to kill him at a moment's notice, yet their postures were calm and relaxed. So what? I join ANBU and just disappear? I'm guessing that is why the old man sent me here in the first place. Now that he actually looked, they had never actually left the clearing he had been ambushed in. Saro answered him with an easy, amused tone. He didn't seem to take much seriously. Pretty much, Hokage-sama believed that ANBU would provide an outlet for your more unsavory tendencies. Not to mention you have killed 2 civilians, injured a clan child and attacked a full squad of ANBU. Naruto snorted indignantly at that but kept his eyes narrowed all the same. Under normal circumstances you would be lucky to see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of your life. As it is, you have special circumstances. Naruto smirked at that, knowing what he meant. I contain the Kyuubi. Without missing a beat or showing any surprise, or even any real care, the masked Taicho simply nodded. The Hokage had theorized some kind of interaction with the beast might have triggered Naruto's sudden lapse in personality. Yes, so now you will be trained by us, live with us, eat with us and go on missions with us until you are either deemed safe to re-enter the normal shinobi corp, or you die in the line of duty. The mask hid all of the man's features but Naruto could still tell he was smiling at the blonde. Welcome to ANBU Karasukohai. Naruto stared at the 3 men in front of him, taking in their calm but dangerous posture. The arms that looked like they could snap his body like a chopstick on Kuma and the slight gleam of metal he could see in Teiko's sleeves. These people were trained killers, little more than dogs for the village to release on their enemies. Sounded like fun. When do I start? The four ANBU smiled lightly behind their masks. Naruto sat in the small, Spartan room he had been provided in the large apartment complex that apparently all ANBU operatives shared. It would seem that extended periods in what they colloquially called the Corp tended to bring out some stranger parts of their personalities, and most weren't the most stable types. Well, in that respect Naruto fit in perfectly, although he did stand out as being exceptionally short. However, for some reason, that just made people look at him warily. Konoha had a long history of child prodigies and the dangerous people they could become. Right now, he was sitting on a hammock made out of the thinnest chains he could make. The bed in his room was less comfortable than what he was used to, and this provided good training, so his teammates actually encouraged it. He could do nothing about the slight glow that his chains gave off, so it would be useless on a covert mission, but that didn't bother him too much. Then again, that might be because he didn't understand what the word covert meant, but he was sure he'd find out eventually. For the last few days his so-called squad mates, consisting of the group that had kidnapped him in the first place, had been running him through various drills to gauge his skill levels. It was tough, and by the end he was battered and covered in cuts, but at the same time he was oddly excited being surrounded by new, strong opponents to test himself by. They would make him stronger because they in turn were incredibly strong. They had proven that enough. He stared down at the mask in his hands again. He was told that once he put it on, it basically stayed on. Uzumaki Naruto would cease to exist, and in his place Karasu would walk away into the world. He grinned at that. It was fine by him. The uniform was comfortable and warm, even if the new tattoo he now sported on his right shoulder stung a little. The people around him were strong and would be taking him on missions where he could test himself, where emotions like empathy meant little and the only thing of importance was the next target. In ANBU he was just another monster among monsters. Karasu was home. Chapter 3, Third Link. Naruto grinned like shark as he backflipped across a small training field, chains erupting from his body to deflect the sword slashes of his opponent. A few shots into the ground, anchoring him and allowing him to use the newfound leverage to suddenly plummet towards the earth. Over the past few months, he had refined his chain use to a second nature. No matter how many he produced, they continued to feel like extensions of his body, 1,000 spindly arms and legs. It helped that, whenever he used them, there was a strange sense of familiarity he could never place. It was like he had been using them for years. It had been non-stop training for him amongst his teammates, as they quickly brought him up to a suitable level for the missions they would be taking. Mostly that involved stamina, strength and speed training. However, playing to his strength, they also spent a great deal of time working with his chains. He had quickly found the chakra constructs to be almost infinite in their versatility and was still just now working to expand what he knew about them. He would spend hours thickening them, sharpening them, making them as thin as he could, and seeing just how long he could make one before he succumbed to pure chakra exhaustion. The answer? Very, very long. He had a lot of chakra. On that note though, his abundance of the fundamental shinobi energy also proved an annoyance, as an important factor for every ANBU operative was stealth. Right now, Naruto was a literal beacon for any potential censors. His so-called comrades on the other hand could suppress their chakra, so it appeared as nothing more than a civilian. When he asked why they didn't suppress it completely, they told him that a spot with no chakra was just as suspicious to a censor as one with an abundance. So, another large swathe of his training was getting him to reduce his chakra levels, or at least how they appeared, to less blinding levels. He darted back, his body spinning and causing his chains to spin about him. Where a few months ago they would have flailed randomly, they now moved in sync with his body, creating a thin, buzzsaw-like effect. There was the grinding sound of metal clashing, and suddenly Naruto was jerked to the side as his chains became tangled up around the naginata his sparring partner had produced. His eyes narrowed as he dodged back, creating two chains that just sat in the palm of his hands like kunai so that he could continue to bat away his attacker's sword swipes as his chains moved to disentangle themselves. One major downside he had found to his chains was that they were enormously chakra draining, however not in the conventional sense. When outside his body they only radiated, or leaked, a small amount of chakra, and as his control improved that amount decreased. Most of the time he could retract them and not feel even the slightest change to his reserves. However, if he had even a section of the dense chains cut off from him completely, or he forcefully dissipated them, he would feel the massive drop in his reserves almost instantly. It wasn't often a problem as the chains themselves were tough, but that never seemed to stop his kenjutsu trainer. Nezumi was the most enigmatic of his new squadmates. Sara was a mystery, but only because he said strange, sagely things all the time. Naruto was lucky if he heard Nezumi say more than a sentence in one day. On the other hand, her skill with weapons was undeniable. Even a common wooden spoon became a deadly tool in her hands. She favored the long, simple-looking katana she always carried, although Naruto couldn't figure out why. The blade was painfully plain, with a simple linen cloth wrapped around where the hilt would be and not even a tsuba for decoration. Then again, it was longer than he was tall and Nezumi could swing it faster than he could even follow if she wanted, so who was he to complain? Again, he leant back as a line of white appeared across his vision and for a rare moment he thought he saw an opening in Nezumi's guard. Immediately he rolled forward, the chains in his hands extending as he forced the individual links to become rigid so it was almost like he was holding a sword. He lunged forward, aiming for her hip, but it was for naught. In a fluid motion Nezumi circled around him, long dark hair and her trademark ponytail whipping out as she cleanly severed through the chains emerging from the blonde's back. The blonde gasped in shock as his body reeled at the sudden loss of chakra. He stumbled but didn't collapse as he might have a few months ago. He couldn't really do much else though, there were a lot of chains wrapped around the damn Naginata and Nezumi had severed them as close to his body as she could with the opening he unwittingly presented her. Slowly, he sank to a knee and panted heavily, feeling a surge of anger as Nezumi returned her blade to her back. These sparring sessions excited and infuriated the young chain wielder because while they provided strong opponents and he could feel himself in turn becoming stronger, they confused him. At the end he would always be at their mercy yet they let him live. Why? He was weaker than them obviously, they could beat him with almost piteous ease and yet he continued to breathe. Why? Nezumi turned to look at him, her mouse-patterned mask tilting quizzically even though it showed no emotion. It is a spar. The woman had a very meticulous manner of speech, as if she was measuring every word. Naruto just figured she was a bit socially stunted, but who was he to talk? What does that mean? Even after all this time he hadn't figured it out, it just went against everything he had told himself. Nezumi came over and crouched down in front of him, the small black dots of her mask's eye holes staring at him for a long few moments. I don't know. Naruto blinked, feeling the rest of his energy leave him suddenly and letting himself fall back onto his ass, supported by his arms behind him. But, isn't it fun? The woman seemed to be genuinely questioning him, the thin pink ribbon tying her hair up fluttering in the breeze. Finally, Naruto grunted unintelligibly before pushing himself to his feet. The rest of their squad had just entered the clearing. Now what? Suddenly Saru disappeared from where they were emerging from the treeline and Naruto felt a sharp, acute pain on the back of his head. Now what, Taicho? The tall man reappeared in front of a grumbling Naruto and the blonde could just tell a smug smile was hidden behind that monkey mask. There was a pregnant pause before Naruto muttered out what he wanted to hear, filled with scathing sarcasm. Now what? Taicho. The man just nodded once as he stroked the bottom of his mask thoughtfully. You should be happier, Kohai. After all, I came to tell you we finally have our first mission. Naruto's head shot up so fast there was almost an audible crack. Really? A shark-like grin began to grow behind his mask. Sara was quick to put a damper on it as he was quickly clipped around the ear again. Really, Taicho? Another long pause followed as Naruto stared at the ground so hard one might almost expect it to burst into flame. Really? Taicho? Sara nodded again before waving his hand dismissively. I wouldn't get excited, it's nothing too serious, just a domestic dispute. However, depending on your performance tonight, you might be going outside the village next time. Naruto didn't risk saying anything that time, just nodding stiffly. Sara was a dangerous man and his hand could move like a viper, more so than even Naruto's chains. He was the man that kept this ragtag squad functioning and for that he may, just have perhaps, almost, squeezed a tiny bit of respect from the blonde. Yay, Kuma will try not to kill anyone this time. After all, anyone that could rein in that beast was worthy of some praise. He ignored Kuma's happy clapping though and turned back to his commanding officer, his toothy grin returning slightly. So? Taicho, a domestic dispute? He could almost feel the man's smile in return. Hana Inuzuka was not exactly having the best of days. Today was the first time the head vet had allowed her to perform surgery on one of the older, retired Ninken. The poor mutt had died on the operating table with Hana's hand still inside it. For a 14-year-old girl that was traumatic in of itself, but Hana was an Inuzuka, she was made of tougher stuff. Of course, not even minutes later she had been called to the academy to pick up her brother. That mutt had apparently been causing a ruckus and was sent home. Their mother was out on a mission with Kuramaru, and Kami knew where their father was, so it was up to the recently promoted Chunin to pick him up. Around Konoha in general, Hana was known as that Inuzuka that wasn't completely nuts, the responsible one even. Hells, she even lacked the wild hair that distinguished them. That was just the surface. Anybody who knew her at all knew she could be every bit her mother's daughter. Apparently though, Emi Inuzuka forgot that little fact when she walked over to the clan heir and made fun of her for having her hair dyed bright orange a few days prior. It wasn't her damn fault that her teammates thought they had a sense of humor and her sensei was a lazy idiot. She quickly reminded Emi of that fact at the same moment she introduced her fist to the annoying girl's nose. Of course, as any scuffle in the Inuzuka clan compound inevitably ended up, the two were eventually found rolling around on the ground, tugging at clothes and generally trying to claw each other's eyes out. That usually wouldn't have been so bad, however Hana's Nin-ken had seen what was going on and decided to join the fray, only they weren't so inclined to hold back at somebody attacking their master. Naturally Emi's wasn't too far behind and it just deteriorated from there. You call this a domestic dispute? Naruto felt an evil presence rise up behind him and caught himself quickly. Taicho? Suddenly the presence vanished and Saru appeared alongside him on the branch above the Inuzuka compound wall a moment later. Well, they are fighting, and we are within the village, so, what do you think, Kohai? Naruto's eye twitched once. He hated being called that. However, as he looked over what could only be described as a full-on fight zone he could hardly dwindle it to a mere dispute. However, it did get his adrenaline pumping quite furiously. Ooh, Kuma can stop them. The brute of a man wasn't too far behind, his bulk causing the branch to bend threateningly. Ah, no. On the other hand, Nezumi was like a feather, her presence barely felt at all as she alighted on the other side of the tree with the grace her codename would suggest. Ah, I think Nezumi-chan is right, Kuma, your solutions tend to end up with a lot of people dead. Teiko was the last to join them, the short man appearing underneath Nezumi's branch upside down in a crouch, his mask not hiding where his eyes were going at all. That was something Naruto was quick to discover about the short ANBU, he was the worst kind of pervert. Ah, Kuma doesn't mean to, people are just too fragile. As Nezumi soundlessly stomped on Teiko's face, causing him to fall off the branch with an intentionally muffled yelp, Kuma twiddled his fingers together. A moment later though Teiko appeared above them again, looking no worse for wear save for the tiny crack on his mask. How about we let the rookie take this one, Karasakun? Saru looked up thoughtfully for a moment before shrugging. The team would be there if the boy got out of hand. I don't see why not, have at it Kohai. Naruto glared at the man for a good few moments before soundlessly dropping off the branch. That was one thing the ANBU uniform was good for at least, besides being surprisingly comfortable, it naturally muffled any sounds his body made when it moved. Plus, he was fairly certain the sturdy body armor and arm guards had saved him from a few nasty cuts when Nezumi forgot just how to properly hold back, or bruises with Kuma in. Well, just about every spar with Kuma. That bundle of muscle actually didn't know how to hold back. He walked quickly through the compound towards the two fighting girls, Inuzuka members that were watching immediately parting for the ANBU, despite his small stature. It was odd, while Naruto relished in the fear of others, the look of respect he received from people when he wore this uniform was almost similar. At the same time, it brought a scowl to his face. It was too fake. The moment he removed the mask or revealed his chains, they would realize who he was, and they would either hate or fear him. Oh great, now his mood was ruined. Still with a scowl on his face, long golden chains suddenly whipped out of his body like an octopus unfurling its tentacles. They snapped at the ground, causing great rents to be torn from the earth and a loud cracking sound to ring out through the compound. Many of the Inuzuka nearby, due to their sensitive ears, cringed at the noise, but the two brawling girls didn't even seem to notice. A wicked smile crossed Naruto's face as he remembered the words of that Kiba boy he had met during his brief stint at the academy. The only thing they respect is dominance, eh? Suddenly the chains whipped out again, a few of the more savvy Inuzuka having already backed off after recognizing just who this particular ANBU was. There was a loud yelping noise as four Nin-ken were suddenly hoisted up into the air with a gleaming chain about each of their midsections. That finally managed to get the girls to snap out of their scramble on the floor, but it was too late. Suddenly two chains crashed into their ribs, flipping them over onto their backs with their heads just inches apart. Another moment later and Naruto's boot-styled sandal was pressing down on Emi's neck while Hana was unfortunate enough to be pinned to the ground with her clothes. Sit! The two Inuzuka women, high on adrenaline and their natural canine instincts, growled at the ANBU, literally growled. It nearly made Naruto chuckle. He just pressed down harder on Emi's neck and moved his chains so that they began to lightly dig into Hana's skin. I said, sit. It was spoken with no more volume than before, but there was now a presence behind it as Naruto suddenly brought the full force of his chakra to bear. The two girls felt it almost as a physical weight pressing down on them and immediately, they were snapped out of their battle daze. Emi even let out a slight whimper, causing Naruto to smirk as he finally released the pressure on her neck. Just what the hell is going on here? The young blonde looked up to see a rather vicious-looking woman with spiky brown hair walk through the front gates of the compound, followed closely by an equally grizzled canine wearing an eye patch. Naruto took the opportunity to tear his chains out of the ground, but made a show of letting them slowly re-enter his body with an unsettling rattle. Just cleaning up a dispute. He layered the sarcasm on thick as he looked about the compound's grounds. It was covered in finger-sized scratches and would look like drill marks. Keep a tighter leash next time. He walked off, leaving Sum looking down at the two sheepish-looking teens still lying on the floor and breathing heavily. The bestial woman couldn't help but notice the red tint to both the girls' cheeks, causing a smirk to break out on her face. Hannah was certainly her daughter, all right, if she was getting flushed from being dominated like that. All right girls, get over here. You're on punishment duty for the next week. Naruto didn't hear anymore as he dashed up to where his squad was waiting for him. So? Sara cocked his head at him, making Naruto sigh before quickly amending his statement. So, Taicho? The man nodded and stroked the bottom of his mask slowly, almost as if he had a beard. Naruto was almost certain he didn't though. Good enough, I suppose. I might have handled things a bit more diplomatically, but I suppose the direct approach has merit. Naruto smirked beneath his mask as he looked to the others. Nezumi looked indifferent as usual, but at least she tried by holding up an awkward thumbs up. Pretty good if I say so myself, kid. You'll be beating off the ladies with those chains of yours if you keep up that domineering attitude. The girls love that stuff. Teiko suddenly cringed, looking over to see Nezumi staring at him silently, a noxious purple aura bleeding off of her. Kuma liked it. And Karasu didn't even kill anyone. The blonde smirked at that, feeling something stir in his chest. It felt odd to be congratulated, to have something he did validated by people and actually have it sound genuine. He did his best to ignore the feeling though, instead thinking of when next he might get to go on another mission, maybe something a bit more exciting. A small group of shadows moved unnaturally in the night as they darted through tree after tree. They moved without a whisper, just another part of the scenery. Not even a single branch creaked with their passing. Finally, they stopped toward the crest of a large hill, the faint glow of campfires lighting up the sky just beyond. Slowly, the shadows melded into people, their black and gray armor serving to naturally blend into the background. The only thing that stood out in stark contrast were the white porcelain masks, gleaming in the moonlight as the hunters surveyed their prey. Their leader, bearing the likeness of Monkey even if his calm demeanor would infer anything but, quickly flashed through a few hand signals, waiting for the nods of his companions. As he made a quick head count, he noticed one of their number missing. Flashing through a few more signals, all he got were shrugs or silence from his squad mates, making the man place a hand on his mask in exasperation. Where did Karasu go? He said, in a hushed whisper so low not even somebody standing right beneath them would have heard. Again, nothing but silence from his team, causing his eye to twitch in irritation. Maybe we left the kid behind? We were setting a hefty pace, Teiko offered lamely, looking about to see if Karasu would appear if he thought hard enough. No. He's fast. Saro sighed. Nezumi was right, Naruto wouldn't have been left behind so easily. He cursed at having such a loose cannon operative under his command, even more so than Kuma sometimes. Can't be helped, we're on a deadline here and that bandit encampment is going to overrun Okazu town at first light. He shook his head before going back over the plan with his team. Getting the all clear, he slowly led them over the crest of the hill. Below them a massive collection of tents, scattered amongst a few campfires, sprawled out across the valley. This was the group of bandits that had been terrorizing this region of Hai no Kuni. They would amass their forces, quickly overrun and take over a town, drain it dry of alcohol, women and money before moving on to the next one. The only reason they hadn't been dealt with sooner was they rarely left anybody alive to reveal what they were doing. However, what they were expecting to see didn't quite match up with the reality. Instead of drunken bandits wandering around, or men sleeping in their tents, they saw what looked like a hurricane sight. Tents were destroyed beyond recognition, fires burned brightly where they were not supposed to, and then there was the blood. Everywhere, the ground was drenched in it. Bodies were strewn haphazardly, left where they had been cut down without mercy. And of course, there right in the thick of it all, laughing and holding up 3 bandits by the throat, was Naruto. He was covered in blood, his normally blonde hair slicked into a murky brown color by it. He watched in almost insane amusement as he slammed the limp body of a man who was already likely dead over and over into the ground until the earth began to crater from the repeated impacts. To the side the other two men watched on in horror, clawing at the golden chain around their throats before they could meet the same fate. Just as Naruto was getting bored with his current play toy and had turned his attention on the remaining survivors, the chains around their necks were suddenly severed. Naruto winced but otherwise remained fine. It was only a small section of chain. The following clip around the back of the head on the other hand. Ow! What was that for? He looked up at Saru and despite the mask he felt the man's eyes boring into him with a dangerous intensity. You acted out of line. Naruto winced. He knew the man was serious as he hadn't even called him Kohai. I completed the mission, didn't I? Taicho? He grumbled. Saru just stared at him for a few moments longer before looking across at the two men now gasping on the ground. We needed at least one alive to question. I told you in the brief their movements were too organized. Naruto shrugged lamely. He rarely listened to those as they tended to go on for ages. He swore Saru just liked the sound of his own voice. Well, there were no shinobi here, or if there were. Naruto smiled darkly beneath the mask only to have the back of his head clipped again, immediately snapping him out of it and causing him to glare up at his commander. Irrelevant, you disobeyed orders, acted on your own end. He motioned about the bloodied camp. The stench was beginning to become something fierce. Used unnecessary brutality. At that moment Kuma walked over, the two survivors under each arm. He carried them with the same ease one might a duffel bag. What does Taicho want Kuma to do with bad guys? Saru took one look at the two struggling men before sighing. I said we needed one to question. With that he turned back to Naruto and in the same instance Nezumi's sword flashed off her back, cleanly decapitating one of the men in a single motion. She didn't even get any blood on the blade. Naruto pointed weakly at the woman indignantly under Saru's gaze. Oh, so what? She gets to kill people and I don't? Nezumi looked at him curiously as she replaced the sword on her back while Saru sighed loudly. We are Anbu Karasu, we kill people. The difference is what you did was not killing, it is slaughter. Naruto shrugged, not really seeing the difference. The look of fear on their faces was all the same to him. There is a reason we are on the right side of the law. A shinobi must know how to show mercy as much as he should know how to kill. Naruto huffed, bowing air out between his teeth in frustration. What's that even supposed to mean? Saru's hand twitched. Taicho. The man didn't answer for a moment, turning back to his squad and quickly issuing orders for them to destroy the camp. Taicho? Saru turned back to Naruto and a note of silence hung between them for a few moments. You'll learn eventually. That's one of the few things I can't teach you, Karasu. And with that he walked off to help his team burn the camp down. Naruto was left standing there looking around at the destruction he had so easily caused. Previously he had felt joyed, hearing the bandits scream and beg. They acknowledged his existence just like he wanted. Now though, the blood that used to be so warm for him felt cold, the screams echoed in his head and he just felt hollow. Naruto stared up blandly at the plain white ceiling of his apartment. He wasn't sure how long he had been lying there now, maybe 2 or 3 hours? He swung lazily in his hammock, hands resting under his head as he just let his mind drift for a while. Normally he would like to keep his mind occupied to stop that very thing happening, but recently he had changed. He hadn't noticed it at first, and it was definitely a gradual change, but lately he hadn't felt the need to just do things. He supposed it was because with his introduction to ANBU he actually had things to think about for once. There were the rules and regulation he had to memorize, the complex but still simple enough hand signal system they used, and even his squad mates. He heard a thump upstairs and sighed. It was probably Kuma rolling out of bed again. For such a giant of a man his room was surprisingly Spartan, other than a small cot to sleep on and a little table that almost seemed comically small when he sat at it. He had little in the way of furniture. The only defining features were the 2 large fridges full of food and the stack of children's board games in the corner. He thought about the glimpses of his other teammates' rooms he had seen briefly, his mind wandering. He had never seen inside Teiko's room. Every time he was invited in, Nezumi would be there to stop him, usually hitting Teiko for suggesting it. He had caught glimpses inside though, and it seemed to be filled with a myriad of strange artifacts he couldn't recognize. In a way it was similar to Nezumi's room, however, hers was filled to the brim with weapons and nothing but. There were more types of weapons in that woman's room than he knew existed, sometimes multiple copies. The strangest thing was that Nezumi seemed to value them all the same. Old antiques sat alongside brand new, standard issue ninjatos. Apparently, to a weapons expert like her, all weapons were equal as long as they did their job. Then again, the woman still seemed to value that one katana on her back more than anything. None of the rooms could compare to Sara's though, if it could even be called a room. It was more like walking into a museum or art exhibition than a place somebody lived in. Masterfully painted artworks littered the wall, sharing space with beautiful calligraphy and seemingly handmade sculptures of varying sizes and materials. There was always the heady scent of tea in the air and stacks upon stacks of books piled up every corner of the room because the few shelves he has were completely full. If it wasn't books it was scrolls, and sometimes Naruto wondered if the man wouldn't have a better calling as a librarian than a trained assassin. But he remembered the man's lightning-quick chops and forgot that line of thought. As he was thinking his head drifted up, only to jerk in shock as he suddenly fell out his hammock. Right above his bed was Nezumi, clinging to the rafter with her toes. She wasn't even using chakra to do it, just her natural dexterity. She cocked her head quizzically at Naruto's reaction before dropping down without a sound. Naruto took the opportunity to stand up and place his signature scowl on his face. He was glad the mask at least hid his surprise. "How long were you there?" Nezumi looked up for a moment and Naruto could almost hear her counting in her head. "Half an hour." Naruto blinked. How did that woman so still and quiet for so long? Wait, that wasn't the problem here. Why? Again, the woman looked up and Naruto just wanted to sigh. Kuma may have been a simpleton but Nezumi was just strange. "I didn't want to disturb you." Naruto placed his hand on his face. "Whatever, just get out." Nezumi quickly shook her head as she moved over to the window. She didn't have to say anything for Naruto to know she wanted him to follow her. Questioning it would just lead to a bigger headache, so he quickly took off after her. All he saw was her ponytailed hair swaying as they hopped across rooftops for a while before they finally reached a training ground Naruto didn't recognize. From the multitude of slash marks he could see on the ground and trees he assumed it was for kenjutsu practitioners. "Okay, now what?" Nezumi held up a hand and a moment later produced a long, thin ninjato that looked perfectly crafted as it glinted in the weakening light. Naruto just raised an eyebrow at it, not that Nezumi could see. "What do you expect me to do with that?" A chain leaked from his wrist and tentatively poked the blade, making Nezumi pull it back to her body protectively. "Too reliant on chains." Naruto's scowl deepened at the accusation. "So what? It's not like I ever run out of them?" Suddenly Nezumi was gone, and Naruto felt a crippling exhaustion rip through his body, forcing him to take a knee. It was as if he had forced out the longest chain, he could only to have it severed at the base. He looked back to see Nezumi behind him having just placed a tag with a few squiggly lines on his back. "W what?" was all he could manage. Nezumi cocked her head as she walked back around to his front, crouching down near him. "Chakra suppressor." Naruto grit his teeth and forced himself to his feet. The shock was tremendous, but once it passed, he could actually move again. He felt as feeble as a toddler and his entire body was suddenly incredibly cold, but he could move. Again, Nezumi held out the sword toward him and for a while he just glared at it. He knew if he simply made to rip the tag off his back Nezumi would stop him. After a while Nezumi's head cocked the other way and she slowly pointed to herself. "Sensei." She then pointed to Naruto and after a hesitant pause, continued, "Student." Naruto grimaced before simply snatching the sword out of her hands. Fine, let's just do this." Nezumi seemed to bounce on her feet for a moment in almost childish excitement. He couldn't see her expression behind the mask so it made for a strange sight. Instead, he turned his eyes to the sword in his hands. He had never held one before. However, as he looked at it, running his hand down the steel and over the hilt, he felt a sort of familiarity. It was almost as if, Nezumi's eyes widened as Naruto suddenly collapsed to the ground, one hand on his temple as he suddenly began to scream, all the while his hand closed tightly around the blade, his knuckles turning white and blood leaking from his palm. Chapter 4, Fourth Link. Naruto took a long, deep breath. It was a cold night so he was able to watch the slight mist escape his mouth and float off before dissipating. In front of him he held out his blade, a long straight ninjato without ornament or decoration. It was a blade for killing, not for ceremony. The few scratches along the steel and the wicked gleam to the edge showed that clearly enough. He took another few long breaths, regulating his breathing with his eyes focused forward. Looking from his perspective, with the sword raised horizontally, it looked as though he was splitting the waterfall in two. Slowly he took a step forward, his foot light and weightless before it pressed down on the damp ground. The slight crunch of the dewy grass was lost in the roar of the waterfall, It was why Naruto liked this clearing so much, it was so easy to focus. His foot pressed down completely and like that, he just moved. Forward, a stab. Sidestep, a sweeping slash diagonally up. Hop back, blocked from the left with a dodge to the right. He dropped down and swiped out to both sides so fast his blade left a silvery trail in the air. More stabs, another invisible opponent dropped to the ground as the blade spun once in his hand. It was needless movement but it diverted attention from his footwork. A sudden and unexpected backstep took him within another shadow enemy's guard and a lightning-fast jab through the crook of his shoulder finished him. His body bent back at an unnatural angle, the sword keeping him propped up so his back was just a hair's breadth from the damp ground. He spun, legs flashing out to take the footing from his final two attackers only he could see. With a final flurry Naruto flicked the imaginary blood from his blade and resheathed it all in one smooth motion. His breaths were calm and collected if not a bit deeper than before, even after hours of practice he only felt slightly winded. His eyes traveled up to the moon, hanging sentinel over the sky like an observer sent to watch his practice. Speaking of observers, he was shocked out of his daze by a sudden slow, rhythmic clap from behind. Wow! He turned, blood rushing to his cheeks and a small bashful smile appearing on his face as he nervously rubbed the back of his hair. What that? That was nothing Tebane. The young blonde-haired boy standing across the clearing from him just smiled warmly as Naruto took that opportunity to allow his long red hair to fall messily about his face, like a curtain he could hide behind. Are you kidding? The Chunin exams won't know what hit them. If anything, the blush on Naruto's cheeks only intensified as the boy was suddenly there, brushing the hair out of his eyes and over his ear. For a moment he was lost in those startling blue eyes, like deep pools that he could look into forever. After a moment he realized where he was staring and immediately looked away, his face aflame as his fist clenched at his side. A second later and he was back to his usual self, a fire burning in his violet eyes. Damn right Tebane. The blonde boy just chuckled in that irritating but adorably flaky way of his. You'll never change, will you Ku? Arg. Naruto shot up straight in a flash, his eyes wide and his chest rose and fell rapidly with his quivering heartbeat. For a moment he just sucked in lungfuls of air, unblinking and unmoving as his mind struggled to comprehend what he had just seen. No. Seen wasn't strong enough, he hadn't just seen that, he had lived it. Every sense was there from the slight damp on his skin from sweat, to the scent of the wildflowers. It was more like a memory than a vision, a memory that certainly wasn't his. Are you, okay? He finally looked around to spot Nezumi sitting a few feet from him, her legs tucked up to her chest as she regarded him curiously. He blinked a few more times behind his mask, thankful it stopped the woman seeing the full effect of his panic. What happened? He asked, only receiving a shrug that jostled the large blade on her back. You screamed, and fell, unconscious. Naruto frowned, was that all some kind of messed up dream? He looked down to see his hand trembling slightly and immediately grabbed his wrist to stop it. No, it was definitely not a dream. Suddenly his hand came up on instinct and caught a blade out of the air as Nezumi threw him one. With a start he realized it was the same one he was holding earlier and nearly dropped it, but his hand wouldn't let go. On reflexes that were not his own, his hand naturally slid into a more comfortable grip on the hilt. The action caused Nezumi's eyebrow to raise behind her mask. What happened to you? Naruto just continued to look at the blade for a while. It was roughly the same length as the one he had seen in, whatever that was. It glinted in the moonlight slightly, giving the edge a vicious gleam to it that made the blade seem almost hungry. I don't know. Both were silent for a while with just the wind blowing their hair to show they were more than just statues on the grass. Suddenly though, Nezumi stood up and drew her blade in one smooth, immaculate motion that left the tip just lightly brushing a stalk of grass. Show me. Naruto frowned at her but stood up all the same. He found his eyes naturally drawn to the way her feet were positioned, the way her hand gripped the hilt, even how her shoulders were slightly tensed. Without him even noticing, his feet moved in unconscious movements that weren't practiced but at the same time felt as though he had made 1,000 times. Nezumi's head cocked at the odd but familiar movements. She swore she had seen a similar stance somewhere before. Deciding not to give Naruto time to gain his bearings for whatever was going on with him, Nezumi flashed forward, her blade leaving a streak in the air. To her surprise, Naruto's eyes immediately followed the motion and he immediately stepped to the side, holding up his blade and diverting the slash to the side before immediately flowing forward with a swipe of his own. To Nezumi's confusion, the perfectly executed maneuver fell short, the swipe only blowing air at her. Naruto looked similarly confused as he looked down at his hands, wondering where all these movements were coming from. It was like he saw Nezumi move and his body just responded automatically. Nezumi pressed the attack again, this time coming down with an overhead slash. This time Naruto dodged back, but much further than he should have needed to. It was almost as if he had something on his chest he needed to protect with the way his body curved away. He tried to use the momentum to swing around and take out Nezumi's footing. Normally that would have been a good strategy. However, Naruto overextended his footing, almost like he was used to having longer legs, and stumbled. His legs fell out from under him and suddenly Nezumi was straddling his midsection, blade poised at his throat. After only a moment of struggling where Nezumi just pressed the blade a little harder on his skin, but never breaking it, Naruto finally stopped. "I give," he grunted irritably. Nezumi immediately got off him, offering him a hand up that he ignored as he stood up by himself. What was that? The only thing Nezumi could compare it to was when she saw inexperienced Yamanaka genin take over a person's body that was too dissimilar to their own. They would make clumsy movements due to the different lengths of the arms and legs, or naturally stand a certain way that didn't match the person they possessed. Like I said, I don't know. When you move, my body just reacts on its own, like reflex. Nezumi's eyes narrowed slightly, that was like no reflexes she had ever seen before. A young trainee does not suddenly inherit the reflexes and style of a kenjutsu master, even if their body is wrong for it. Show me, again. For a while Nezumi danced around Naruto, carefully observing how his body reacted to the things she did. All of the blonde's footings, save when he over or underextended, were perfect. Likewise, his grip and the way his eyes tracked her was immaculate. The only problem was he seemed to be trying to use the movements of somebody both taller than him, and oddly somebody with breasts. He lacked the flexibility for many of the stunts he attempted and it showed. "Stop, you need to learn the limit of your reach," she chastised, as Naruto growled at her for slashing him lightly on the arm to remind him of his mistake again. At this point the boy was littered with tiny scratches no deeper than a paper cut, each a mistake he had made and one he wouldn't soon repeat if possible. The problem seemed to be the fact that these reflexes were deeply ingrained, only they were wrong. This meant Nezumi would have to first make Naruto unlearn all of this before teaching him again. It was going to take longer than she thought. "No, too far, again," she intoned blandly as a tiny cut appeared on Naruto's wrist, nearly making him drop his blade from the shock, but he didn't. "Take smaller steps." Another cut on the back of the leg, again never deeper than half an inch. Nezumi's control was perfect. "There's no need to lean back so far." Another thin scratch to the small of his back causing the blonde to wince. "Stop protecting things that are not there." A scratch just above Naruto's heart and the boy finally snapped, throwing his sword into the ground where it easily bit into the earth before lightly vibrating where it stood. "Damn it, I'm trying's databane." Immediately Naruto's eyes went wide as he slapped his hands over his mouth over the mask in shock. What the hell had he just said? Likewise, Nezumi just stared at the boy for a good long few moments. She had never heard him use that verbal tick before. All of this was very strange for her. She had never dealt with something quite like it, and in ANBU, she had seen a lot. This was more a job for Saro. The man was a lot more knowledgeable than her. He always knew what to do. "We're done for tonight." Naruto just grunted with a small nod. His hands were by his sides again and he quickly stuck them in his pockets as he stalked off back towards his apartment. Nezumi watched him go with curious eyes before silently vanishing into the night with barely a flicker. She was sure that whatever was going on with Naruto would pass, maybe. Hopefully it wouldn't affect him on missions. Two guards stood idly in front of the gates to a large compound, the impressive stone wall rising up behind them to deter any attackers. One sat in a chair, leaning back on it and swinging his feet idly. The other just leant against the wall, tapping his long naginata on the ground to a tune only he could hear. Both would have been heavily admonished by their captain had he seen them lounging like this, but neither could be bothered to care. It was late and they weren't even supposed to be on this shift. They had to cover for a couple of idiots that had gotten a bit too handsy down at the local geisha house and had been thrown in a cell for the night. "Hey, would you stop tapping that thing? I can't think for shit." The one with the bladed spear scoffed, never noticing as a long glowing chain slowly descended from the shadows behind him. "Yeah, and what would you be thinking about Kisuke? Tell me your deep ponderings, O sagely one." His sarcastic voice masked the subtle clinks as the first chain was joined by an identical twin, this one creeping up on the seating man. "Hey, you never know man, I could have this amazing idea for that story I'm writing." As he sat forward on the chair to argue with his partner, the two chains moved into position, the bladed ends poising to strike at the chink between their helmets and the back of their breastplates. "Oh yeah, that story you started 2 years ago after reading that stupid smut." It would be a quick death, painless and sudden as their spines were cleanly severed, one moment there, the next, gone. Hey, Ika is not smut, it's a dedicated tale of a lone shinobi willing to cross any boundary for love. The chains quivered in anticipation in harmony with their wielder only for both to suddenly jerk as a hand reached out and grabbed them, tugging them back into the darkness. Yeah, the boundary of a hot spring maybe, it's totally for perverts. Neither of the guards ever realized how thin a tether their lives had been hanging on that night. Further around the compound a young blonde was slammed bodily into a wall as his octopus-masked superior glared at him stonily, the glowing golden chains still grasped securely in hand. What the hell are you doing, kid? Taiko's voice couldn't even be compared to a whisper, concealed in the shadows like that the two ANBU operatives were completely invisible. What are you talking about? Naruto's tone lacked the experience but it was still suppressed so they wouldn't be found. His eyes didn't meet the small holes in Taiko's mask and his voice was gruff and dismissive, at least as much as an 8-year-old could sound. I'm talking about those two guards you were about to kill. What about silent infiltration and assassination, did you not understand? Naruto huffed as he pushed Taiko off him, the older but short man being forced to let go of the chains. The spike suddenly grew from the glowing links. After whatever had happened to him back with Nezumi, his control over both his chakra and his chains had improved dramatically. It was like he had been dealing with large amounts of chakra for decades. Whatever, if they were dead, they couldn't call out to anybody. Taiko just placed his masked face in his hand and shook it for a moment. Normally the short man was fairly calm and lighthearted, so it was rare to see him this irritated. Oh yeah, and were you going to kill every guard on patrol to stop them noticing as they walked by? Naruto's eyes narrowed as he dropped to the ground quietly, his chains retracting into his body with only a dulled clinking. Maybe, if I had to. Taiko shortly joined him, staring right at the younger operative their squad had taken under wing. They could understand him somewhat as they were all outcasts in their own way, but that didn't mean they had to stand for insubordination and attitude. Listen, Kohai. Naruto winced at the stressed word. He knew if Taiko was saying it he was being deadly serious. Our unit, while dysfunctional, has a near-flawless mission record. I'm not letting you ruin that for everybody else just because you think you need attention. You may be just a little kid, but you're also an ANBU operative. There's supposed to be a measure of responsibility that comes with that title, so start acting like it. Naruto growled, but he said nothing. Throughout the entire speech Taiko had never raised his voice or given it an aggressive edge, he was just stating facts. Fine, Naruto finally ground out between gritted teeth. It wasn't like he had much choice. Taiko was a master of infiltration and always seemed to be everywhere at once. If Naruto stepped out of line, he would know. Then Sara would find out, and it made Naruto wince just thinking about the consequences. The team captain wouldn't just give him a verbal grilling. No, he would set him some tortuous tasks and call it training, all with that smug, self-righteous tone of his. Is everything okay? Suddenly there were three of them as Nezumi seemingly bled out of the shadows like some kind of phantom, her body noiseless. Taiko simply patted Naruto on the shoulder fondly and cocked his head at the woman in his usual flippant way. Ah, Nezumi-chan, you didn't think to check up on old me, did you? That's so cute. Nezumi stared at the diminutive man for a few moments before lazily pointing at Naruto. Not you, him. Immediately Taiko's whole body seemed to slump forward, an imaginary raincloud over his body as his voice came out in a sulky, but still quiet, tone. Oh, so cold, Nezumi-chan, so cold. Nezumi simply regarded them for another few moments before dissipating back into the shadows like she was never there. Almost immediately Taiko straightened up, shot Naruto a warning glance and vanished over the wall, leaving the youngest operative to himself. He growled once before following them over. It was all just so frustrating. All these rules, all these regulations, this chain of command, these limits on what he was allowed to do, these damn flashbacks, visions, memories or whatever they were. It was really starting to get to the blonde. It wasn't just an isolated incident, and as Naruto hopped the wall into the large, sprawling estate they were infiltrating, he had the feeling they would only get worse if he didn't do anything about them. The problem was he just didn't know what to do. Naruto walked listlessly through the quiet nighttime streets of his village, although thinking of it as his village made him internally scoff. Konoha was as much his village as the sea was of piranhas. He may live there, but he certainly wasn't welcome. Luckily his ANBU mask and uniform kept his identity somewhat secret, especially when he wore his dark cloak to cover up his hair. It wasn't too much of an issue tonight though. There was a light rain and it was already past 1 in the morning, so most people were in their homes asleep. It was peaceful, quiet, and Naruto hated it. He had gotten used to the general activity ANBU life had brought him, so these moments of inactivity, however brief, were irritating. Whether it was out taking missions that pushed his body and mind to their limits, then passed them, or just eating in the canteen with the other operatives, he just wanted to be busy. Although, having his squad mates steal his food when he wasn't looking was beginning to grow annoying. The real reason he hated all the quiet was because it let him think, and when he thought his mind drifted to less pleasant topics. His past, his treatment, his burden, the things he had seen in ANBU, the things he saw in his visions, on his own they were inescapable. The only reason he didn't try to sleep them off because in his dreams they became even more vivid, even harder to ignore. Often, he would see the memories of this person that seemed to inhabit his mind, normally inconsequential things like a stroll around a familiar village or running through a kata in a training field. He sighed as he passed by a nearby alleyway only to wince and place a finger against his temple. Over here. The blond boy called to him, a wide smile on his face as he took Naruto by the hand and dragged him down the alley and out of the rain. Already his long crimson tresses were soaked through and hung like a sopping curtain over his eyes. All the same, a grin split his face as he just allowed himself to be pulled along, enjoying the warmth in that simple contact. Naruto groaned as he shook his head of the brief memory. They seemed to be growing more frequent ever since that training session with Nezumi. On the other hand, they were growing easier to tolerate, they were no longer debilitating on missions, which was good. On the other hand, Naruto was growing scared. What if he was growing used to them? Already he had felt himself changing, saying things he wouldn't normally say, walking in a way that he didn't even realize looked all wrong for his body structure. He shook his head, trying to regain composure as he took a deep breath only to unconsciously smile as he caught a whiff of something that smelled unbelievably good. "Hey Tsuchiya-san, what's on the menu today?" Naruto called out happily as he skirted under the curtain into the small ramen shack. The kindly man, no older than 30 or so, grinned back at him as he rubbed down a small bowl. "Well, if it isn't my number one customer." He turned back, tapping on the door to the back area of the small food stall. "Hey Akane, look who's here." A few moments later and a young woman of around the same age as the stall owner walked out, her long brown hair tied back and a clean white apron covering her front. "Ohayou Tomato-chan." Naruto's eye twitched as he self-consciously brushed his long hair back over his ear, although he could never get angry at Akane. The woman was just too nice and her voice too gentle, he knew she never really meant it. "You know I hate that nickname Akane Obasan," Naruto whined, immediately earning a light bop on the head from a long wooden spoon, only to look up and see no such implement present and Akane with an innocent, but oddly dangerous smile. "Just like I don't like being called auntie, it makes me feel old you know." Naruto just chuckled at that as Tucci walked over with a massive steaming bowl of ramen, a good 3 times the size of a normal portion. "The normal I presume then for Ichiraku's number one customer?" Naruto grinned brightly, brushing his hair back over his shoulder before tucking into the meal with a quick hit at a kamasu. It was demolished in no time at all and soon he was able to lean back on the stool, a contented and happy expression on his face. "Ah, Ichiraku make the best ramen ever Tebane." Akane and Tucci just chuckled as the older woman walked back into the rear of the shop, Tucci quickly moving to prepare a new bowl. "And don't you forget it young lady." Naruto gasped as he snapped back into reality, his eyes going wide before he forced them back into his usual scowl. That was usually the way it went, he would flash back to a memory until a strong enough reminder came along that these were not his memories. It could be noticing her breasts, someone using the wrong pronoun or usually, someone calling him by her name. He still didn't know whose memories exactly he was witnessing, they usually cut off before he got the name. He had tried to talk to Saro about it as the man was like a fount of knowledge on every other conceivable subject. However, the normally wise and helpful captain of their squad didn't have much to say on the subject. He seemed just as clueless as everybody else about it. The only thing he could recommend was having a Yamanaka look into it. Unfortunately for Naruto, due to the Kyuubi there was a standing order that no Yamanaka ever delve into his mind, they couldn't know the consequences. A grunt of frustration escaped his gritted teeth as he roughly slammed his fist into a nearby wooden beam, nearly splintering the poor construct. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily as he thought about his own helplessness in the situation. He was losing himself, slowly or not, and for the first time in a long time he was genuinely terrified. But he was Karasu of the ANBU, he'd go out kicking and screaming if he had to. "Nobody subsumes my personality without a fight Tebane." His eyes immediately widened when he realized what he had said, before his entire body slumped, his shoulders going slack as he nearly collapsed to the floor. For a moment he just stared forward unblinkingly before quietly picking himself up and walking off. He couldn't wait for the next mission, he needed something, anything to keep his mind busy. While it was still his mind. Up on a shadowed rooftop, a set of hidden violet eyes watched with curiosity and concern as Naruto stalked off. She had watched his small internal argument and had almost intervened, but by the time she worked herself up to it, Naruto had already picked himself up and dusted himself off. It was one of things she rather admired about the young boy, his will to never give up, even if it just came out as pure stubbornness sometimes. She was about to take off after him, keeping up her self-imposed mission of making sure he was okay, when she felt the faintest of presences alight on the rooftop beside her. "Having an entertaining night, Nezumi-san?" Nezumi didn't need to turn to recognize him, his calm voice and familiar chakra told her everything she needed to know. "Saru, Taicho." She inclined her head slightly, her eyes still following the young cloaked boy wandering off through the quiet streets. "I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish from up here, Nezumi, just watching the boy won't do much." Nezumi's hand tightened momentarily. She knew it was a fault of hers, but her pensive, thoughtful nature just wouldn't allow her to act so impulsively. "Then, what?" Silence was her answer for a while, until Naruto had moved out of sight and her legs were itching to follow after him. "You know, he's changed a lot since joining the squad. They may be subtle, but they are there." Nezumi nodded. She had noticed both the changes happening to Naruto because of environment, and because of whatever inner turmoil he was going through. "He's not the only one." Nezumi finally tore her eyes away for a moment to look into Sara's blank mask. "Teiko-san has learned to be a bit more discreet with his less that savory habits." Nezumi's fingers instinctually twitched toward the blade on her back at the mention of her perverted teammate's codename. "Kuma-san is starting to understand the limits of his strengths. Did you know he almost managed to spar with Karasu for a full 30 seconds yesterday?" Nezumi blinked. That was rather surprising for the brute that supposedly had no ability to hold back. "Just give Karasu-kun some time, you may even surprise yourself." And like that, Sara was gone like a whisper, and for a few moments Nezumi just crouched there and pondered his words. Had she changed since Naruto joined the squad? Naruto growled into his mask as he twisted his body in the air, quickly latching onto a nearby tree branch with his chakra-infused foot and using the leverage to launch himself away just as the tree was pelted with a barrage of Kirigakure's unique kunai. The thrower of the weapons was quick to pursue, trying to get in close only to be forced back as the ground around him was transformed into a sea of wicked golden chains. They whipped and lashed out randomly, trying to pin down the annoyingly flexible man. When he moved into the trees to get away from them, they simply sliced through the trees, once again forcing the enemy shinobi to the ground. "Ha, a Konoha shinobi actually getting rid of trees? Isn't that a crime for you?" Tree hug. The man's rant was cut off as Naruto appeared in front of him, blade poised to strike. He parried it, using the perpendicular spike on his kunai to hold of the blade at the tsuba. However, it only lasted a moment before his entire body convulsed before going limp. In the split second he had halted Naruto's forward momentum, the boy had let loose as barrage of chains from his chest that easily speared through the man. "What are Kirigakure doing out here?" Naruto was thankful the voice modifier on his mask didn't give away his age as the gruff, slightly garbled tones emerged from his blood-spattered mask. Unfortunately for him, the man had no answers to give as he slumped over, his body giving out on him from the shock. "Damn!" As Naruto slid the man off his now red-tinted chains, he growled again in frustration. He was sure he aimed for non-lethal spots. Admittedly, he had fired almost a dozen chains into the man's chest, but it wasn't like he punctured an organ. A sigh escaped his lips as he wiped off his brow, only to frown as he felt his mask fall off his face, a long crack running right down the middle. Seemed the enemy's kunai were slightly more on target than he thought. Sara wasn't going to be happy when he got back from his mission. That was the 7th mask he had broken in his tenure in ANBU, and he was beginning to gain a reputation for it. For now, he simply pulled up the scarf around his neck to cover the bottom half of his features and allowed his lengthening hair to fall limply across his eyes, held down by the blood drenching it. Even at his short stature, he made for an intimidating sight, covered in the crimson life fluid, glowing chains still writhing around his body. After making sure his identity wasn't too compromised, not like it already wasn't, he set off into the woods to locate the rest of his teammates. A few days ago, Saro had declared his skills roughly on par with a Chunin. At just under 9 years old, that was something of an achievement. However, for Naruto it just means that like every other ANBU out of their training period, he could now be assigned to other teams. He was still a part of Sara's squad, but often ANBU lacked the manpower to have such clearly defined squadrons. As he thought about his new teammates' reaction to having Kusari no Naruto on their team, even for a mission, he wanted to laugh. He thought it was a fairly stupid and unoriginal name, but you couldn't really complain to the people who made the bingo books. Naruto had checked. Today he was in a three-man cell sent up to the land of frost for some reconnaissance. It was supposed to be fairly routine. Naruto could count the number of routine missions he had been on with both hands. Something always found a way to go wrong. This time it was likely because they had a rookie in the group, and with Naruto only having been in ANBU for over a year, that was saying something. This was the girl's first real mission and already it had gone to hell. They hadn't expected the team of Kiri Chunin to be there. Unfortunately for them, their Jonin commander apparently wanted no witnesses to whatever they were doing. As he alighted on a tree branch overlooking a clearing, he spotted that very same commander lying in a pool of his own blood, not too far from Naruto's other teammate for the mission, also dead. Over on the far side, the rookie was holding out admirably from a combined assault from the last two remaining members of the Kiri group, the other three lying scattered about in the forest wherever Naruto deigned to drop them. He sat on that tree branch watching the young girl get pushed progressively further and further back, spinning her metal bow staff in obviously practiced motions that, unfortunately for her, were just too slow. For a moment Naruto considered letting the girl just die, one less rookie he'd have to worry about. It wasn't like the ANBU commander could refute his report if he was the only one left. Unfortunately, the paperwork he would have to fill out would be a pain and he already had enough suspicion on him from the higher-ups without this on his shoulders. With an aggrieved sigh, he dropped to the ground and walked forward without a sound. The young ANBU recruit winced as another cut appeared across her arm, but she didn't relent as she managed to divert the follow-up attack to the side with her bow. She was doing well, but it was obvious if this kept up she'd go the way of Toritaishu, and Karasu was nowhere to be seen. Even as she thought those words, desperation alone guiding her hands and feet, the Kiri Chunin in front of her suddenly paused. A moment later and she nearly gagged in her mouth as the man was literally ripped in half at the waist, each section supported by a recognizable gold chain. The man's partner was so shocked at the sight he couldn't even react as his limbs were suddenly skewered to the floor, although the scream that ripped from his throat was very real. And there, behind it all was Karasu, drenched in blood and viscera, his shaggy golden hair set free by his lack of mask, something he was notorious for in the ANBU. He took one look at her with those cold steely blue eyes that on any child should have looked youthful and bright, but on him it simply looked as though he was only seeing her weaknesses. Usagi, right? Naruto often struggled to remember the names of people who weren't his regular teammates. It didn't help the masks' designs were rather vague on the animals they represented. Usagi merely nodded, her body frozen in place, as Naruto casually flicked the two halves of the Chunin off his chains and retracted them into his body with an unsettling rattle. Thank you. With a start Usagi realized that this boy, the one that was talked about in hushed whispers in the ANBU canteen, who was slated as a demon and an unfeeling killing machine, had just saved her life. However, the boy simply looked at her, managing to look down on her despite her obvious height advantage. He huffed once before turning to the man he had pinned to the ground. You nearly died, you need to get stronger or I won't be around to save you again. And with that rather aggressive statement he stalked off toward his new prisoner to work out how he was going to get the Chunin back to Konoha without him bleeding out, a problem he had all too often in his opinion. Once his back was turned Usagi slumped to the ground on her knees, her eyes wide and her breathing heavy. Just being stared at by that boy was like having a house placed on her shoulders. His chakra was so dense and powerful that to a censor like her, it was too much. Oi, get up, we have to destroy the bodies. She was forcefully yanked to her feet as Naruto appeared behind her again, picking her up by the back of the uniform. It snapped her out of it though, and a shaky smile appeared on her lips behind the mask. Alright Karasa-senpai. Naruto paused at that and quirked an eyebrow at her. That was a first. No other ANBU had ever referred to him with anything other than impassivity or a simple kohai. Whatever. He never saw as Usagi's eyes drifted along his glowing chains, taking in how they radiated a soft, warm light. Like cracks on a plate, Naruto had a way of touching people in unexpected ways. Not always for the better. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.